Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you this morning. And I was very proud I'm slightly shocked, and still slightly shocked to be in this role. And it's all the more humbling because of this 90th anniversary of the agricultural lectures of Rudolf Steiner. And that has given me considerable cause for reflection because I was, whatever it was, in the autumn of 1972 and 1973, 43 years ago, is it? 42 years ago, a student at Emerson studying the agriculture lectures. And mindful of the fact that I was going to speak with you this morning, I retrieved one of my copies of the agricultural lectures, which happened to be a copy which was owned by Melanie Rebeck, who did the agriculture course with me in 1972-3, and whose brother, this is in fact the reason why I'm farming, came to us as a student when we started farming in Wales a year later. And then I'll tell you the story about the farm, but basically the long and the short of it is that Nick Rebeck, who died a few years ago, God rest his soul, he bought the farm and gave me a tenancy. So my ongoing occupancy of my farm in West Wales is directly related to Nick and to Melanie. And Melanie doesn't know this because I suspect that what happens, as so often does happen with these things, is that Melanie said, "Why don't you borrow my book? Because you need to know more about biodynamic farming," to Nick, and then Nick never gave it back. So I looked at this book, and it's full of these extraordinary notes, because Melanie's she's got very neat handwriting, and she's annotated all the way through the lectures, fascinating observations. This was Herbert Kurpf and many other lecturers we had. Jimmy Anderson was another person that greatly inspired me when I was at Emerson. It was just riveting to read through them. And particularly, there were some particularly dense passages where she just had a question in the margin. And that really touched me because I thought Rudolf Steiner's wish was to address farmers who were worried about the devitalization of their soils and their crops, and they needed guidance. And all these years later, we're in exactly the same position. I heard something on Radio 4 yesterday, a 105-year-old man who was interviewed, I think, on the Today program, and he'd got some Jewish children out of Czechoslovakia, and he was asked about what he thought about history, and he said, "We never learn anything." And it really struck me, this is very poignant, because in this week's Farmers Weekly, there was a tiny little piece on the right-hand margin of one of the pages, news pages, saying only 100 years left of harvests. And basically some scientists have been looking at the effect of intensive agriculture on soils, and they are now saying that we have been intensive farming has been mining the soils, and there are only 100 harvests left before we've depleted all the accumulated fertility of millennia in the quest for, industrial scale food production in just half a century. And it's so poignant to reflect on the fact that here were these East German farmers in 1924 searching for an answer to a question, which is my question still, and I'm sure your question too, which is, what can I do? How can I play my part in my short chapter on the surface of planet Earth, bringing greater vitality to this little pocket of the planet that I have the good fortune to look after? And if you think of all the land that is which is represented here by all the people here, where we've all got our little bit of planet Earth, and we are striving to bring greater vitality into its soil and its biological life. And every day it's a question, what are we doing this for? What is our purpose here? What are we striving for? And it was exactly those questions I assume anyway, which brought the farmers together to hear Rudolf Steiner in 1924. And another reflection I had was that I spoke of, I think it must have been 8 or 9 years ago now, at the Goetheanum, at one of the international biodynamic conferences. And Nikolai Fuchs was the international director at that time. And we sat outside the Goetheanum afterwards and reflected on the atmosphere of Dornach and the sort of, I always felt slightly sort of claustrophobic and introverted atmosphere, which I found quite difficult when I was at Emerson, to be honest. And he said, Nikolai said to me, I sometimes wonder if Rudolf Steiner came back today and saw the result of all his good work, whether he would relate to it or not. And there's this issue of, lost in translation, and now, the teacher has died 2 generations ago, so we now are inheriting his ideas and his impulses, and it's for us now to bring them into the 21st century. And I think, for me, this is a really interesting question, because how do we remain true to the founder's impulse, and yet how do we also verify it for ourselves and risk, because I think it is a risk, losing the core in the translation, but at the same time keeping it true for ourselves? And I think for me, this has been an ongoing question, because I have my own search, both in life and in a sort of deeper spiritual sense. And this has caused me to ask this question of my role as a steward of the farm that I'm still on after 41 years, and my wider role. What is it that I'm striving for? And how do I relate, for instance, to the ideas that Steiner brought in the agricultural lectures, if I don't completely relate to them or can't find an expression for them or with them on my own farm? So my own farm is a very good example. It's not a biodynamic farm. It's certified organic and has been for many years, but it's not biodynamic, even though, as I've already explained, the ideas of anthroposophy and biodynamic farming have been a huge influence on my life and will, I'm sure, remain so. But I'm trying to navigate a sort of survival course on my farm between wanting to honor and reflect the impulse that Steiner brought, but at the same time stay viable. And just a couple of examples of that. Our cattle are Ayrshire's, and yet they don't have horns. And that's really an economic compromise, because we haven't been able to afford yet, anyway, to accommodate the cows in the winter in a way which allows them to keep their horns and not damage themselves. And because I'm also away a lot, it's difficult, I think, to farm biodynamically unless the people surrounding you and doing the work on the farm buy into the teaching and the philosophy. And that hasn't happened either. So I'm naked in front of you as a patron without a practicing biodynamic farm behind me. And I sort of apologize and don't apologize for that at the same time, because maybe it brings another interesting question, which is, as I understand it, Rudolf Steiner's teaching and his ideas for biodynamic agriculture were definitely not intended just for a self-selecting few who gathered every year to reinforce their own conviction that they were right and everyone else is, going in the wrong direction. They were surely intended for the whole of agriculture. And if you think back to the Farmers Weekly article this week and the ongoing devitalization of the world's soils, then surely what we need to bring through our collective influence is transformation of all the world's soils and return of vitality. And we're a long way from that. And yet, even though we are so far away from it, when we are in possession of these ideas and this knowledge, then surely our striving must be to do everything we can in the time we have available in our gardens or our farms or whatever position we have to be in, to try to increase the vitality of the land and the animals and the plants that we are stewarding, and get those influences out to other people. So on that note, I'd like to apologize for not arriving last night, because I can feel the atmosphere already that you've generated, and it feels incredible. So many young people here, and what a fantastic venue. And I've also looked at the conference program. I really wish I was staying, but unfortunately I've got to go back to my farm, move some bales from a field which is still out, milk the cows twice tomorrow, and then go to Kazakhstan on Sunday, as you do. And I don't really want to do that. I'd like to. I mean, no offense to Kazakhstan, which I'm not even sure where that country is quite, but I'll find out on Sunday. But apparently it's amazing. And I'm doing a lot of travel, which is taking me away from this country, but also my farm. And I'm not really a natural traveller, but it's something that, it's fallen upon me to do at the moment. But it means that there are, things that I can't do, and one of those is not stay here, which I'd really love to do, so I apologise for that. I apologise for sort of parachuting in and then leaving precipitously. It's not because I don't want to stay, it's just because I can't. What I thought I'd do is say a little bit about myself first, just to give some context. I was born in Braintree, Essex, and spent most of my childhood in and around London. My father's a doctor, a psychiatrist, and his work took him to Palo Alto, California in 1970 and 71. I was born in 1950, so I was 20 at the time. And that resulted in me falling under some very interesting influences in the San Francisco Bay Area at that time, as a result of which some people say if you can remember it, you weren't there, but I do remember it. And I came back a year later, slightly reluctantly, convinced that the world was on the edge of an ecological catastrophe, and the only sensible thing to do was to prepare for the ongoing collapse by getting back to the land and setting up a rural self-sufficient community. So we headed west, as you did in those days, to a part of the world which attracted a lot of young people like us, and set up a farm which was 135 acres. We're farming more land than that now. And from day one, we tried to farm as sustainably as we could. We bought a foundation herd of 30 Ayrshire cows, the descendants of which are still in the herd today. And we started farming, really learning about it as we went along, although I had the preparation at Emerson College and an intensive dairy farm in Hampshire, and that was about it. So we learnt by practice. And for me, that was a very important part of my perspective on agriculture, is that so many farmers today arguably have to unlearn what they've been taught in agricultural colleges and other institutions, and I didn't have that handicap. I was completely naive and learned as I went along. And we pretty soon found it. We started growing wheat and milling it on a stone mill. That was the inspiration of Jimmy Anderson from the Seasons in Forest Row, selling it to the local Whole Food shops in Aberystwyth. And we started growing carrots a bit later and taking them to London to sell them to Cranks and Whole Foods. And all along that time, we sold our milk to the Milk Marketing Board, which was then dismembered and replaced by co-ops. And first of all, we sold it as conventional. And then in 1985, it was pretty hard to survive economically. So we thought, well, why don't we write down what we're doing and take this story of more sustainable farming to the public? And this, in terms of the Soil Association, with which I was beginning to become involved at that time, was the beginnings of the development of organic standards in the organic market. The standards were actually drafted in the 70s, but there were no livestock standards, so I wrote down what we were doing as dairy farmers at the time, which was full of compromises, and still is. They became one of the early drafts of the organic dairy standards. I was on the Soil Association Organic Livestock Standards Committee, and then that was a major influence on the UK organic standards and subsequently the EU and the USDA National Organic Programme and other standards. So I can say, having been at the beginning of the development of the organic market and then subsequently quite heavily associated with its growth when I was at the Soil Association, I can offer some reflections on that, which I'll come to later, which is that what we were really doing in developing the organic standards was kind of a survival mechanism to try to stay economically viable in a climate where doing the right thing by sustainable principles wasn't economically viable in the real world. And you could argue that looking at the whole development of the organic and the biodynamic movements from that perspective, that they've been a success in the sense that we've now developed a market which is billions of pounds and it's all over the world, and people know where they are when they buy organic and biodynamic food. But at the same time, as I was referring to earlier, meanwhile, the world has continued on the trajectory of intensification, and the combined work of the biodynamic movement, the organic movement, the local food movement, the sustainable food movement, arguably has not broken through into the mainstream. So a question, it seems to me, a especially important question to ponder on this 90th anniversary of Steiner's agricultural lectures is what impulses are needed now to try to amplify the results of our work so that these ideas become mainstream. Because it's become clear just really in the last few years, even to the agricultural establishment, that the so-called perfect storm of climate change and resource depletion and population growth and diminishing area of agricultural land, devitalization of the soils, loss of biodiversity, pollution, impact on public health of our present food systems, if you put all that together, they are definitely not sustainable. And in response, various commissions have been established. The UK government set up a commission. I was on it. It's called the Foresight Commission on Future Food Security, and I was just one of the advisors. And they came up with a term called sustainable intensification, which somebody said recently would have been, a scientist actually said, would have been better named sustained intensification. Because in a way, it was a sort of clever way of saying, let's carry on with business as usual, but just label it in a slightly different way and be a little bit more responsible about the way we go about it. And the point I'm making really is that the influence of biodynamic thinking and organic thinking and the thinking of the sustainable food movement on those people who are leading that initiative, well-meaning people, is pretty marginal. And so that really, I think, is one of the challenges for our movement at this time. How are we going to extend our influence into mainstream thinking about food systems and agriculture without diluting our radical principles? And for me, that really is a huge question. And it was and remains a factor in my decision to establish the Sustainable Food Trust after I left the Soil Association in 2010. Because something that made a big impact on me was something that Monty Don, who was and still is the president of the Soil Association, said to me when he came to a conference that we organized in Newcastle in, I think, 2006, which was a great success, several hundred people. We had a slow food meal, and it was very convivial. Maybe it wasn't quite the atmosphere that you've already generated, but it was pretty good. And he said to me, after he spoke, and it enraged the growers, because he was talking a slightly sort of diluted and worldly sense. But anyway, he said afterwards, he said, I can't help feeling that you're just talking to yourselves. He said, you know, you may be convinced you're right, and you may be stewing in your own collective organic juices and having a great time, but meanwhile, 98% of the population have absolutely no idea what you're thinking about or speaking about. And your responsibility is to reach out to the people who are confused, who are perplexed, who are ignorant, and without whom the changes that are needed won't happen. Now, at the time, this really stung me, because I felt that it was a very necessary part of our movement to come together, and I still do think that, to reinforce our collective endeavors and inspire ourselves and all those things. But equally, I think it is a very important question for us what we do in relation to what Rudolf Steiner was trying to do in 1924, which is to extend an influence right into the world to change the whole of agriculture, not just the people who happen to be attending the lectures. And the Sustainable Food Trust, my new organization, really is a response to that challenge. Because although I don't think I've lost any of my radicalism, I've become convinced that if we are to be able to influence change, it's not possible only to speak to people who are already on your level. I think one has to be respectful of people who are not on your level and to use language and speak to them on the level that they're at. And in a way, this is also another challenge for our movement, which is that we tend to sink into jargon and words that and concepts that we understand. But if we can somehow speak to people from our hearts and with sincerity about the issues that we care about, even if they are really radical and really challenging what they're doing, I think it is possible to have that dialogue without sort of selling out. That's, of course, the risk. And it's that sort of tightrope that we're walking if we are going to succeed. And one of the big challenges that I want to share with you, which has come to me as a sort of revelation in the last couple of years, relates to what Rudolf Steiner said and what I said earlier about interpreting his ideas and slightly with some trepidation going into territory where what he said in the agricultural lectures wasn't quite what I'm feeling now, relates to soil. And it goes something like this. I was told some years ago that plants don't have a stomach, and you could think of the soil as being akin to the stomach of the plant. And that went in a little bit. But then I heard a woman who was the head of public health in Iowa a couple of years ago give a talk about the human biome. And this is the collection of organisms that coexist with us in our stomach and other orifices, as she put it. The sum of which is 3 times the number of cells in our body. And these organisms, mainly bacteria, but also fungi and viruses and other organisms, they're not simply present in our bodies. They coexist with us in a symbiotic way and are responsible for our capacity to digest our food, to make ourselves well when we get sick, and many other functions. And she gave an example which I think is relevant, and again it's sort of slightly challenging to Rudolf Steiner's discussion about manures, that she gave the example of antibiotics which are being used to treat people with incurable diarrhea, which is becoming epidemic. I guess it's E. coli, and increasingly the E. coli organisms are resistant to the antibiotics. So when you give yourself a dose of antibiotics, it wipes out all the beneficial bacteria. Remember, they constitute probably 10% of your body weight. And then the E. coli are the ones that are resistant to antibiotics have a field day. So funnily enough, by using the antibiotics to treat this diarrhea, they were making it worse. So they then have discovered that using fecal implants, which they were transferring from spouses, they were getting an 80% recovery rate in patients that were otherwise not responding to the antibiotics. And for whatever reason, this insight that gave me the connection that I hadn't really had. I knew, for instance, and I've known for many years, that plants spend 30% of their energy exuding sugary saps into the root zone, which nourishes this symbiotic community of bacteria and fungi upon which they depend for their digestion. So they are attracting the fungi and the bacteria into the root zone, and then the bacteria and the fungi break down the organic matter, and then the result of that is that the roots can absorb the trace elements and minerals and the substances they need for their nutrition. I knew that, but it was sort of intellectual. But when this woman said, this is going on in a different way, in a similar way in our own stomachs, it suddenly was a moment of revelation. And I realized that not only can we see the plants having an exogenous stomach, which is the soil, and if you think of the soil of the planet as being a vast collective stomach of all the plants in the world, an organ of digestion, which is really what it is, and plants using the soil as their stomach to digest the organic matter that they can't otherwise get access to, which then nourishes them, and our stomach being in microcosm an exact replica of that. We eat, the bacteria in our stomach digest our food. Without them, we wouldn't be able to stay healthy. It suddenly made me realize that I need to relate to my soil on my own farm in a different way. And although I had all this intellectual knowledge, it was somehow emotional and visceral. And as a result of that, Now, when I walk on my farm, on my soils, I feel as if it's like walking on a stomach. And I can see that how I nurture all these symbiotic organisms, either through the manures and the compost that I apply to the land, or through my crop rotation, or through avoiding the rotation of my machinery at the wrong time and stocking at the wrong time. This can have a profound impact on the life of my soils, which I can relate to very, very personally. And I've been thinking that in some way, this new understanding of soils, which is much more personal and using the metaphor of the stomach, could have real traction and get people to understand in 2015, the International Year of the Soil, that the soil is not something remote, which soil scientists talk about in a slightly mysterious way, or even biodynamic people talk about, but it's something which is very personal, and we can relate to it very easily through understanding that it's akin to our own stomachs. And I read another book on a plane to Los Angeles about 3 weeks ago called Missing Microbes by a man called Dr. Martin Blazer. And he is head of the medical center at New York University. And this book has been described as the silent spring of bacteria. And it's about how Western populations in particular have been self-medicating through antibiotic prescriptions, and also ingesting, particularly in America, antibiotics in their food. And of course, the clue's in the name about antibiotics, antibiotic. It kills all the beneficial bacteria in the stomach. And as a result of this, we're heading for a lot of, not just antibiotic resistance, which is causing a problem when we go into hospital and have hip replacements and all that sort of thing because they don't work anymore. It's much worse than that. He came up with this hypothesis that in the same way that antibiotics are used as a growth promoter, especially in America, for all farm animals, why would it not be that the children who are having this medication with antibiotics, the average child age 5 has had, I think, between 5 and 8 courses of antibiotics. They start at birth, ear infections, stomach infections, all that sort of stuff. Plus, they're getting it at a dilute level in their food because of the antibiotics that are used in agriculture. In the US, it's 80% of all the antibiotics used in America are used on farm animals. He came up with this hypothesis that why would it not be that the growth-promoting impact of antibiotics in livestock would not have the same effect in children. So he found a control group of children that hadn't had antibiotics, and he compared their weight statistics with those that had, and he found out that it was true. And he then has done more work, all of which he writes about in this book, showing that there are direct links between childhood obesity and probably adult obesity too, diabetes, a whole range of allergies, and all this is traced back to our wrong understanding of bacteria and their symbiotic relationship with us. And I think this is a profound moment because we are arguably now at the end of a chapter of agriculture which was dominated by chemistry and reductionist thinking. And surely now we're at the beginning of a new chapter which should be informed by biology, by interconnectedness, by systems thinking, and by more than that, in relation to the ideas that Rudolf Steiner brought in his agricultural lectures and the biodynamic movement. And I think it is incredibly important that this conference is happening, that the biodynamic movement is so vibrant today. There are so many young people here. It feels very optimistic that this impulse is so alive today, because it isn't enough, as Rudolf Steiner said in the lectures, to just think about the biological activities of the soil and the sort of domain of the organic movement, although I would say that from my own personal perspective, the organic movement needs to embrace these sort of ideas in a new way, as we all do, I think, at the present time. But it needs to be taken further into the sphere of vitality and finer forces, which are more hard to measure by science, but nevertheless all of us are convinced exist, and which inform and have very substantial effects on the plants and the animals over which we have stewardship. And back to my point about the soil as the stomach of the plant, and the thinking of Martin Blazer and the ideas he brought in this book, Missing Microbes. When I read the agriculture lectures, he talks about how the soil needs to, he talks about inverting the human being and how the above ground life is the stomach, and below ground it's the head. Now, I've been pondering this. It's one of sort of Melanie Rebeck's question marks in the margin, because I feel sure that there's a way in which I can understand this, and I feel sure that if Rudolf Steiner was here today, he would want this conversation to be happening, conversation with myself so far, and there probably is a spiritual dimension to this discussion which can coexist with the biological metaphor which has influenced me so much. So I don't personally sense that these two ways of thinking are mutually exclusive. And I think it is a demand on me and on those of us that are thinking about these ideas to try to make sense of his agricultural lectures in a new way as the evolving science enables us to understand more about the biology of our own organism. Because after all, none of the stuff that I've just been talking about, which Martin Blaser has written about and where soil scientists are just beginning to understand, was really available to Rudolf Steiner in those days. How am I doing for time? I would like to stop perhaps in 15 minutes or so and have an exchange, because I think that's important. I will end by showing some pictures of my farm just to sort of give some context. Perhaps I should talk a little bit about the work that I'm now doing, because it's taking me to Kazakhstan the day after tomorrow, and it's relevant. The Sustainable Food Trust was set up in 2011. It's a UK-registered charity. It's based in Bristol, but it works in the US and all over the world as well. We have a 501c3, which is a registered not-for-profit in the US. And our mission is to work collaboratively to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems. And we're focusing in our work in three areas. We're a small organization. We can't do the work. We see ourselves more of a catalyst and a seeder of ideas and new thinking, especially in people in positions of influence in some of the organizations that perhaps haven't been quite on the right course in the past. And so our focus of area of work is in three areas. The first is building collaborative partnerships with individuals and organizations working in the wider food movement. That might mean conservation organizations, development organizations, financial institutions, food companies, anyone who has an interest in food, which of course should be everyone, who could make a difference in stewarding these new ideas and to get them more widely rooted in the world. The second area in which I'm supported by my colleague Richard Young is to accelerate better quality research, filling the gaps or drawing on existing research to illustrate issues that need to be revealed to the public and eventually inform governments, which would enable us to move forward and create the better conditions for sustainable agriculture. And I would like to give an example. I'll give an example of the first area, which is this partnership building. I was in Holland 2 weeks ago for a one-day meeting organized by a man called Volkert Engelsman, who has anthroposophical roots, has a big company, the largest company trading in organic produce in Europe, and he wanted to meet Monsanto, so he brought 3 representatives of Monsanto to the headquarters of AOSTA, and we spent 3 hours talking with these people who were human beings and had children and were quite sort of, ordinary, really. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. But it's amazing how we demonize people, and then when you meet them, they're just ordinary human beings. And I think that that's an example of the sort of work that I'm doing. Also have had quite a lot of contact with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle. I was just there a few weeks ago, because it seems to me that if we could persuade Bill Gates, who I think is essentially well-intentioned, and his wife, not to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the kind of smallholder farming systems which increases their dependency on hybrid seeds and fertilizers, and instead have different ways of measuring success for those programs based on holistic thinking, systems thinking, building soil fertility. This would mean that it would help the hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds that are being spent by people like us to not have to be offset against the larger force of all that money that's spent on the wrong kind of development. And that would be another good example of that sort of subtle influencing process. But we're also building collaborative partnerships with organizations in the conservation movement. That's another theme that we're exploring, because I think if you look at the conservation movement based on the ideas of Rachel Carson back in 1962 when she wrote her book Silent Spring, she correctly identified that agriculture was the problem because it was killing all the wildlife, but the response of the conservation movement has been not to change agriculture because it was presumed that this was impossible, because the economic imperative to produce more food and the efficacy of pesticides and the addiction of nitrogen fertilizer and pesticides in combination was too strong a force for the conservation movement to counter. So they adopted a policy of nature parks, mitigating the damage by continuing intensive farming, by establishing wildlife areas or wildlife margins. And this has now become enshrined in EU policy. So we have all these so-called agri-environment schemes, which sound good, but actually what they're encouraging farmers to do is to continue, well, they're not encouraging, they're allowing farmers to do, is to continue to farm intensively on the vast majority of their land and sacrifice, paid for, 5% or 10% of the land area where they do stewardship stuff, beetle banks, bogs, ponds, all the sorts of things that we're encouraged to do in the higher level stewardship schemes, or in the case of Wales now, Glastier, or it was Tir Gofal. And these schemes have institutionalized a mindset which sees food production here and nature conservation there. And we know that if we want to protect and save and reinstate nature, we have to change the way we farm. This thinking has to be embedded in conservation organizations, because otherwise, in the next round of Common Agricultural Policy Reform, all the WWFs and the RSPBs and the wildlife trusts of this world are going to simply say, oh, well, let's have more money for stewardship, not realizing that if they take that money for stewardship, they're going to entrench the existing system further. And that's the sort of work that needs doing, introducing people who are running these conservation organizations to a different way of thinking, because otherwise we're not going to get the traction that we need to make the change that's necessary. Now, on the research and development side, a good example of our work in that field is a project which we've called True Cost Accounting in Food and Farming. And this is about how, as we found when we went back to the farm in 1973, which eventually necessitated the development of organic standards, entrepreneurial, or we have a day job like me, or we're just spending the capital that we inherited or something like that, it's pretty hard to make a living. And I've been pondering that question for some time, and we've come up with this idea, it's more than an idea, this reality that in the present system, all the damaging costs and outcomes of the present intensive farming systems are not paid for, charged or paid for by those who cause them. So I'm speaking here about emissions, pollution, depletion of natural capital, impact on biodiversity, social impact, cultural impact. All these real costs are not charged to the farmers who are farming intensively. To give you just one simple example, a farmer in this country buys a kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer. It costs about 87 pence. They use that fertilizer on the land, and it has a 3 times return on investment. So it produces them 2 or 3 pounds of extra income. So there is a business case for using nitrogen fertilizer, which is why the vast majority of farms in the UK use nitrogen fertilizer. But the European Nitrogen Assessment Programme, with a lot of EU scientists, have done some calculations on the so-called externalities arising from the use of this kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer. And it turns out if you just add the ones that are not disputed, putting a value on the emissions, on the nitrogen pollution, and the health costs which are agreed, not the ones which are more not yet proven, it cancels out the advantage, the financial advantage for using the nitrogen fertilizer. So in other words, if you put a tax on nitrogen fertilizer today in proportion to the undisputed financial damage caused by its use, you would eliminate the business case for its use. But that hasn't happened. So as a result, nitrogen fertilizer still remains the dominant way of farming. And nitrogen is a salt, so it kills off the soil biology, the fungi and the bacteria, which I was referring to earlier. So it's just like the sort of antibiotics used to treat our illnesses. it induces a sort of dependency on more fertilizer because we are killing off the soil biology upon which plants can nourish themselves in a different way if we look after it. And so you see there that the economic system is distorted, even to a point where you could say it shouldn't survive an audit, because that's just nitrogen fertilizer. What about the soil capital that I referred to in the Farmers Weekly? If we are mining the soil, we should put a value on that. What about the loss of biodiversity? You know, how do you value that? What about the jobs that are lost in agriculture, et cetera, et cetera? So we thought, well, what is needed here is an organized program of work which would identify and categorize all this range of what economists call negative externalities arising from different farming and food systems, quantify the damage caused, like what the nitrogen people did at the EU, but all the range of externalities, and then also look at it on the positive sense. So if we are farming biodynamically and we are building soil carbon, why shouldn't we be paid to be carbon stewards? If we could identify the impact of a particular farming system on soil carbon outcomes, then we could set the stage for farmers who are delivering benefits to society to be paid for the benefits they deliver in proportion to those benefits. But that means you have to be able to measure them. And if we were to pull all this information together, communicate it in plain English to ordinary citizens who are interested in this stuff because they want to stay healthy. I mean, if you think about the Missing Microbes book, who's not interested in the ecology of their own stomach? Because these are major negative health externalities, actually. So think a bit about it that way. All the antibiotics used in agriculture, put a price on the damage caused in the health service, and suddenly you've got the government's interest. Because you're talking about billions of pounds here of negative impact on public health directly caused by our food systems. So this suddenly becomes interesting, but in order to present this body of knowledge, the economic damage unpaid for caused by our present food and farming systems, we have to get some good science to stand it up. Then we need to communicate it to the public, and then we've got the preconditions for governments to take action, for instance, to introduce a nitrogen tax, or to reward farmers by transferring the agri-environment payments into a carbon stewardship payment, all that sort of thing. But until we do that, I think that's one of the reasons why sustainable agriculture is stuck in this marginal situation where those of us that are trying to farm in that way and make our way in the world are only able to do so marginally, and mainstream farmers won't take us seriously. So that's a very good example of what we're trying to do in the Sustainable Food Trust. And the third area is communications, because we can see that change won't happen unless the public understand these issues. And there has been a way of thinking about organic food and organic farming, which is, I think, prevailing a lot in the organic movement throughout the world, which is that all we need to do is to grow the organic market, to use the phrase. And I don't think we need to do that at all. Indeed, I don't think we need to grow the biodynamic market. I think we need to abandon these terms and speak about issues. And I think we need to treat every citizen as a person who is intelligent, who has a thirst for knowledge about these issues, and somehow make them accessible in ordinary language. So it's more important to make everyone an expert in the misuse of antibiotics on their own biome, or, by extension, what's happening with nitrogen fertilizer in the soil, why that's damaging to us downstream, etc., or to link endocrine disrupting chemicals used in agriculture to the range of cancers which appear to be growing exponentially these days, and allow the public to make their own decision about what kind of food they want to buy. And meanwhile, we are doing our work as biodynamic or organic farmers to develop our systems so that our systems become a sensible response, a refuge, or better than a refuge, for the people who have been alerted to the problems which have been caused by the present farming system and want to do something about it. But I think there is a certain laziness about retreating into terms like organic or even biodynamic, even though we will continue to farm. I think I've covered enough stuff. I've probably left a few things out, but maybe, I mean, if there are things that I haven't covered or stuff that I've said which provokes you to want to raise an issue, should we have the remainder of the time that there is to have an exchange? How much time is there? A bit. Yes. You mean, why am I going there? A man called Ken Wilson, who runs a foundation called the Christensen Fund in San Francisco, who's actually a Brit, his foundation is focusing on cultural diversity in agriculture. And he's been going out there for many years. And apparently, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, all the intensive farming systems were just trashed. I mean, they just didn't work, and they've unraveled. And there is an amazing, vibrant, sustainable agriculture movement out there, which is really healthy and probably not like our organic and biodynamic movements, no offense, slightly like this, but it's got more kind of reach than that. And they are developing markets, and they're developing a sort of land scale extension into sustainable agriculture. And they're having a conference, and Ken said, I want you to go there. So I said, okay, so I'm going. And that's about all I know. I'm going there for 3 days, and I should be back on Thursday. And I imagine I'll know a lot more when I get back. But it's the sort of work that, the sort of connectivity work that I hope that the Sustainable Food Trust can contribute to. Please. Hi.
Around carbon capture and microbiology. And I've got a burning question inside now. Would it be prudent of us as biodynamic influenced growers or stewards of land to bring our work alongside biochar with the storage of microbiology, the ability to influence and increase a coral reef-like status in our soils again? And you mentioned 100 years of harvest left. Well, looking at terra preta and how the quality of microbiology in that, and how we can reach that again within 10 years. Sure, and with obviously carbon capture as another addition to that, and then for dairy farmers particularly, the ability to work with offsetting methane. Surely it's prudent for us in the Biodynamic Society now to really work closely with other organisations like biochar and influencers like that, bringing that into our compost. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, positive, but I've seen a very small, I don't know how much people know about biochar, but essentially, this is my very possibly inaccurate summary of it. You make charcoal out of biomass, and then put it into the soil in small chips. And because it acts, as you said, like coral, it acts as a host to soil bacteria and other organisms, and a refuge, which means that you're maintaining an improved soil biology structurally in the soil, and tests show that it has a very beneficial impact. And of course, in the terra preta systems of South America, the soils have maintained fertility, fantastic fertility over centuries, because it's fairly stable once it becomes carbonized, this biomass. Is that fair? Well, I don't know how you can extend that to a farm scale in the UK. So, for instance, we annually trim our hedges, not all of them because we do them in rotation, but it always struck me that it's a strange thing to do, to just go around the farm using a lot of diesel, with a flail mower, and if it would be possible to allow the hedges to grow up and then coppice them and then chip that maybe and turn it into biochar, that would be probably a better way of harvesting all this biomass. But I guess the key thing is there the kit to do that, which could make commercial sense for a farmer? And I don't think there is yet. But if there was, I would be up for being part of the design of that, an experiment of that, because I can see that it would probably benefit our own soils, and it's completely compatible with organic and biodynamic farming. Yes, please.
How in your vision, Patrick, do you see that we managed to get the herbivores basically as a foundation for our against the rules that are sort of made to have to set aside and then cut the soil, cut the weeds and everything down first. I mean, in India, they've done it. They make it a religion to have herbivores everywhere. Sacred cow, for instance, you see. So I wonder how we can do that without having to, well, probably have to make, you don't want to make it a law because then people don't do it all, but some way of getting it to become really something we see, the visual effectiveness of it.
Well, the honest answer is I don't know, but I think that's what we have to do. We have to reinstate the role of the cow in particular, and the ruminant in general, as having a high sort of social status within agriculture, and work with animals. Anybody who works with cattle, it's such a privilege to work with them because they're so amazing. And what they do, they're talking about the human biome, the cow biome, is even, just extraordinary and mysterious in a way. So yes, I agree with you. How to do it? I mean, it reminds me of an issue which I didn't mention, which is how we can encourage a generation of young people to come into agriculture. I think many young people intuitively get a lot of this stuff that I've been trying to discuss. I don't know exactly how it happens. It's sort of like a knowledge field which is out there, and young people are more sensitive than fossilized older people like me, and they just absorb this stuff and they're ready to do it. But the conditions, as I was saying, for young people coming into agriculture are not very conducive economically. And we, the farmers who are the stage for hopefully helping young people to come into agriculture, I think we need to do more to create. I know there's the apprenticeship scheme, the Biodynamic apprenticeship scheme. Well, I think those sorts of schemes are vitally important and they need to grow. When on my own farm, we don't have apprentices. Why don't we have apprentices? It's crazy. We need people to come and work with us and we haven't got them. So I think that getting young people who will understand and embrace these ideas in ways in which we can't even imagine, and work with cattle and want to work with micro dairies and just do new stuff, they need to find a way of coming into agriculture. I think that a lot of it will then look after itself. And then, of course, these ideas about ruminants, the current orthodoxy needs challenging. And it's quite difficult for us, because I mentioned the Eating Better Coalition. We've been having a dialogue with them. And it's a bit difficult for us to say to the Eating Better Coalition, well, actually, we don't agree with you, because that's, we're all about collaboration. But we're sort of steeling ourselves to say, well, actually, we don't agree with you. It's not that we don't agree that you should eat less chicken and pork, but the danger is that the ruminant bathwater, the baby, is going to be thrown out with the bathwater in this debate. So I think this is about a public debate about the importance of cattle and ruminants, and reinstating their social and economic status, and then young people building new systems.
One of the visions I have is really to have farm-school twinning. It's because at Pro Hatch, where I work, we have the regular 8 to 10, 12 groups of different school children coming from far away as Frome and Canterbury and London, and they come for 3 days. If every farm could do that, you're bound to get some feedback and end up with a school-farm twinning or farm-school twinning.
Absolutely.
Older people, older generation, what are they going to do? There's so short of people. So that's my banner.
I agree, and think the idea of beacon farms as educational stages for children and for older people, students and farmers. One of the projects which we're aspiring to develop is an international network of beacon farms open to the public. So if you were going to go to another country and want to be inspired by the farms, you'd be able to find them, because there are networks all over the world that already exist, and you could find them on a map and then either visit them virtually or physically go to them. So I think the role of farms in educating the next generation is critical.
Turn it on? Yeah. Hi. I've been doing a lot of thinking about, with the help of Rudolf Steiner, this whole question of evolution of food and consciousness, and looking at how there's a midpoint with the agrarian type of developments from milk and honey, bread and wine, to the mineral, and looking at this downward trend, which is going towards acidity, kills our gut flora, and addiction, things like coffee. I mean, animals would not touch 1/4 of the things that we are addicted to. And every cup of coffee that's sold makes £1 profit for the people selling. That's just one example. It's killing our gut flora, making us cynical, and, you know, taking a lot of land, making it acid too. So not many people seem to be talking about this. What do you think?
I think that moving to make the ecology of the soils and the biome of our own digestive system more complex and to move away from the acid and the dead towards more life is absolutely what we need to do. And I think that, you know, your work in advancing that sort of thinking is amazing. Speaking of coffee, I've got my own problems there. I don't, surely if you take a drug like coffee and you use it very consciously, it can be okay. I've always sort of clung to that idea. But yes, I mean, it's so interesting. I think our attitude towards bacteria needs to change. This is one of the most interesting things, it seems to me, because we're culturally, you know, we've been waging war on bacteria for, you know, it's just become the norm, isn't it? And the environmental health people who put the fear of God into all the small-scale producers, dairies and, you know, small-scale meat people, and then all the chopping board stuff that you have to spray. It's terrible. And as Richard Young said, my colleague, he said, bacteria will have the last laugh, which I think is rather a nice phrase. And actually, it's even better than that. We need to celebrate bacteria, you know, because they are it's the whole thing, really, isn't it? We need to find a new and much more positive relationship with our own stomachs. I think there's a lot in that. And by doing so, we can then sort of bridge into the soil and the ecology of the farms and the gardens that we're managing.
Hi, I'm Ella Hashemi, and I'm part of a new initiative called the Groundspring Network, which is seeking to unite beginner farmers and growers with each other. It's a non-denominational network, so it's seeking to transcend camps of agriculture. We're really keen about providing a space in which beginner farmers and growers can connect with each other and share stories and strength and energy and enthusiasm. And I was really interested in what you were saying about connecting to the wider food movement and how we language what we're doing, because we're really keen to transform the cultural narrative around agriculture. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you are languaging what we're doing specifically with farmers in mind, so how you engage with farmers in different camps of agriculture, to transform how we talk about what we do.
I think what you're doing it sounds amazing and exactly the thing that needs to be done. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure how or how much I'm doing of what you say, but I think that, like, for instance, I was invited to participate in a panel discussion at the NFU conference a couple of years ago, and I think, in a way, those gatherings are arguably the most important of all, because it's amazing how, you know, all farmers are actually brothers and sisters on the land, and they share a common language. It doesn't matter where you go. I was in Zimbabwe with Ken Wilson because his wife, ex-wife, was Zimbabwean from a small village down there, and so I had the privilege of staying in a tiny village with, you know, self-sufficient agriculture, and it was completely common language. It didn't really matter. We were involved with soil, water management. There was too little there, and, you know, all that sort of containing livestock, all the same issues. And so I think when you speak to farmers, conventional farmers, they have a thirst to communicate with people as long as they just don't feel threatened. And I think sometimes if we tell it against ourselves, you know, like that's what I think we have to do in a way. We have to say, look, we haven't got all the answers in this movement. And we are we're looking at issues, which often is a way of reducing barriers. If you label something, then immediately people get defensive. But if you say, there's an issue here, how can we deal with it? And then you say, well, of course you're using nitrogen fertilizer, it makes more money. And suddenly they can kind of relax and think, oh, okay, it's not what, it's all right that I'm doing that because there's a reason for it. So I think we need to think very strongly about how we can engage with people who don't necessarily yet buy into some of our thinking. And if we label ourselves and are slightly aggressive in our postures and separate, then we'll just alienate them. And it just strikes me about wars, It's clear that I can see this in my own personal life, that it's so easy to build up barriers with people, and then quite quickly that can escalate into terrible tensions, and they manifest in the world as wars. So if we can find a way of reaching out to people outside our own comfort space, it's amazing what an effect that can have. So I hope it sounds great what you're doing.
Hi, my name's Sophie. I didn't think I was going to ask a question, but the thing that's come to my mind, I suppose, reading Rudolf Steiner and listening to your talk today, nobody kind of like touching on housing and home and where you live. And I think that's really kind of like key because it all links, doesn't it? So you've got the soil where you grow food, but first of all, you almost also have to have a home that is healthy as well. And so if we have a growing problem currently at the moment where a lot of people, especially in the UK and I suppose around the world, are living a lot more in private rented sector, which is you've got a landlord, and sometimes the conditions of where you're living can have a massive adverse effect on the food and where you shop and everything else. And I'm just want your views on the home and where you live and how that all correlates, because I think the soil is important, but then also you need somewhere to live to do that. And yeah, I think that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
So maybe if one thinks of this interrelatedness of everything, so if you understand the soil, or you understand your own body, or you understand the cell, then you can understand the whole. Then in microcosm, the home and the family, whatever dimension it manifests in, is like a biome. It's like a family biome. And it's, it's bacterial, it's emotional, it's energetic. And you can feel that this country, I was just looking at some houses around here, I went out for a run this morning, and you can just feel that everybody is sort of, if you look at all these bungalows, and people are creating their sort of space around them and coming back to it. And in a way, that's what's happened, isn't it? In this feeling that you've got this space which is your own, and where your family manifests. And it's almost become a sort of retreat and a fragmentation. There's no longer this feeling of cohesion and interconnectedness in urban communities. So how this sort of thinking can manifest in the social and cultural life of cities and individual families and homes is a very interesting question. I mean, I don't know, but I think you're right. It's so interesting, and all of us have our own impressions, as I'm thinking now, of my own home and what that means and how it sort of goes out into the community. And then, of course, the internet age, there's another question. With all this virtual communication which is going on, how that can be harnessed, because all these things can be harnessed for good or ill. So I don't feel I've answered your question, but I agree, it's a crucial issue.
Simon Charter. Thank you, Patrick, very much. I must say I've really got a lot out of what you've shared with us. There's one aspect which I would like to highlight, and that is you mentioned the positive externalities as well as the negative externalities. And my sense is that we've known for a long time since Silent Spring about negative externalities, and we tend then to lead a life of avoidances, you could say. And if we could do more research to highlight these positive externalities of the systems which spring not from reductionist thinking, but spring from you could say organic or organismic type thinking. Yeah, it would make life a lot more enjoyable, and we would be working more out of our love for doing things with, you could say, positive affordances, as opposed to avoidances. And I wonder whether you might like to say something about what research might be able to bring that more to light, the positive externalities.
Are you really referring to positive externalities in the social and cultural sphere?
It could be either. I mean, because I think these are very integrated. What's happening in the ecological and what's happening in the social, they can't be developed in isolation.
No.
They need to be developed together. But it's both, really. How do we really make these more apparent in our research? And that, I think, would hopefully give us a more holistic viewpoint.
Yes, and I think what your question brings is it touches on, because in a way, the science, if it is an economic science of externalities, is about money. It's about putting a price on things. And you could argue that that's a deadening impulse, but in fact, I don't think it needs to be. And of course, Rudolf Steiner spoke about this. But let's say that there is a meeting point between the easily monetized and the not so easily monetized. So well-being and some of the social and cultural positive externalities which arise from holistic farming and food systems are not so easy to put a price on, and yet they're precious. So I think it is this chap called Pavan Sukhdev, who's an Indian guy who has introduced the idea of TEEB, he called it, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. So he tried to put a price on nature, which is actually not so easy. What price an orchid, that sort of stuff. And you end up with different, mechanisms for trying to put a value on things by asking people how much they pay for, wildlife meadow and all that sort of thing. But some of the more subtle cultural and social and well-being outcomes of more holistic thinking and application in food and farming are much less easy to just reduce into numbers, and yet paradoxically vital. And I suppose that also, just because Sebastian said this has got to be the last, there's no more time. But in a way, I suppose that just causes me to reflect on the question of how much we can speak about these things which are not so easily reduced into money or physics or chemistry, because either science doesn't understand them yet, or science has rejected them altogether. And of course, in the spiritual dimension and the area of that level of refinement, this is much more hard to speak about without just sort of, causing a sort of prejudicial reaction with the people you're speaking to. And yet I think now is the time to do that. I think it's very important that we should try to express this search, which is subtle as well as more obvious. And in a way, it's like I feel that the biodynamic movement is a bridge, a vital bridge, to connect the biological to the vital and spiritual in operating in the sphere of agriculture. And it is really needed at the moment, at this present time, where so many people feel they can't answer this question, where is the meaning in my life? What's the purpose of my existence? How can I relate to something higher? The structures that used to glue society together seem to have evaporated in the post-war period. And yet there's this very strong search, I think, which is manifest in millions of people to find a sense of identity and relatedness to place and there's some sort of deeper connection with why I'm here and what I'm trying to do in this brief life. So I would just like to say thank you very much for all that you're doing in the biodynamic movement. And I'm going to also be speaking to the North American Biodynamic Conference in Louisville, Kentucky, in 2 weeks' time. So I'm very happy to be here this morning, and I thank you very much for putting up with me.